The night the security alarm went off in their Yorkville condo, Petra Sinclair was standing in the hallway with a glass of water she'd poured and forgotten to drink, staring at the man she'd married 11 weeks ago as he stood over two unconscious men in the foyer, her 6-year-old son asleep against his chest like none of this was happening. "Go back inside," Colin said quietly, not a command. Something gentler than that, which was somehow worse. That was when Petra understood that the contract she'd signed, the one that was supposed to be clean, temporary, and emotionally uncomplicated, had never been any of those things. But she's getting ahead of herself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. 8 weeks before that hallway, before the alarm, before she knew what Colin Marsh was really hiding. The boardroom at Hollowell Capital smelled like old ambition and fresh desperation, and Petra had been sitting in it for 40 minutes before anyone acknowledged she was there. She'd worn the charcoal blazer, the one her assistant called the closer, the one she'd bought with her first real paycheck 12 years ago, and still wore when she needed to remember she'd earned her way into rooms like this one. She was 38, single mother, acting CEO of Fenwick Medical Devices, a company that had been quietly bleeding out for 2 years. She had a presentation, a plan, and a son named Avery who'd asked her that morning if she was going to be okay. She'd told him yes. She wasn't entirely sure she'd been telling the truth. The man across the table was Gerald Ashworth, silver-haired, expensive watch, the kind of patience that came from never having to wait for anything in his life. He'd been reviewing her file for the past 3 minutes, with the focus of a man trying to find the one clause that would end the conversation. "Monsieur Sinclair," he set the folder down, "you understand what we're proposing. You want me to get married. We want Fenwick stabilized. The board has concerns about optics. A single female CEO at the helm of a struggling medtech company is a narrative problem in certain investor circles. That's illegal to say out loud." Ashworth didn't blink, which is why I said optics. "The arrangement is straightforward. You marry a man we've vetted, 18 months. You maintain full operational control of Fenwick. In exchange, Hollowell commits $40 million in bridge financing and backs your bid for the Ridley contract. The Ridley contract, 300 beds across 4 Ontario hospitals. The deal that would save Fenwick, save the jobs of 214 people, save the thing Petra had spent a decade building. Who is he?" Ashworth exchanged a look with the woman beside him. Catherine Yee, legal counsel, face like a closed door. That look told Petra everything she needed to know about how much she was going to like the answer. "His name is Colin Marsh. He's a contractor. Builds custom cabinetry and furniture, works out of a shop in Leslieville. He has a 6-year-old daughter, no criminal record, a carpenter." Petra let the words sit there. "You want me to marry a carpenter. We want you to marry someone outside the usual financial circles," Catherine said. "Someone with no existing loyalties to the families involved. Someone credible enough to deflect scrutiny but without the profile that would invite it. Someone nobody would look twice at," Petra translated. "Someone disposable. What's in it for him?" Ashworth slid a second folder across the table. "He has debts, medical. His daughter had a serious illness last year. He's been managing the bills on a cabinet maker's income." Petra didn't touch the folder. She looked at the numbers through the cover. She thought about Avery, who'd eaten cereal for dinner twice this week because she'd been too tired to cook. Who'd stopped asking when things were going to get better because at 6 years old he'd already learned that some questions had no good answer. She thought about Fenwick, about the 214. "I need to meet him first," she said. Catherine's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not respect, maybe the distant cousin of it. "Thursday," Ashworth said. "We'll arrange it." The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Carlaw Avenue, wedged between a coffee roaster and a place that repaired vintage bicycles. The sign above the door read Marsh Woodworks in clean hand-painted letters. No logo, no Instagram handle, just the name. Petra stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. Inside, a man was sanding the edge of what looked like a dining table, moving with a careful, unhurried rhythm that felt out of place in the city. He hadn't heard her come in over the sound of the work. She took the opportunity. Tall, maybe 6 feet, dark hair showing early gray at the temples, forearms that told you he actually did the work himself. There was something precise about the way he moved, not rushed, not lazy, like someone who'd learned a long time ago that patience was more efficient than speed. "Mr. Marsh." He straightened slowly. When he turned around, his eyes were a quiet shade of gray, and they looked at her the way a person looked at a situation they'd already thought through from several angles. Assessing, careful, not unfriendly. "Mrs. Sinclair." His voice was low, unremarkable. "You want to look around before we do this?" "Do what?" "Decide whether I'm someone you can tolerate for 18 months. He picked up a rag, started cleaning sawdust from his hands. I figure that's why you came instead of just sending legal. Petra crossed her arms. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more easily explained. Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement exactly. Recognition maybe. I could say the same. They looked at each other for a moment, two strangers standing in a room that smelled like cedar and linseed oil, about to negotiate something that would change both their lives. You have a daughter, Petra said. His posture didn't change, but something behind it did. A quiet shift like a door locking from the inside. Sophie, she's 6. My son is 6. His name is Avery. She met his eyes. If this happens, he's not a prop. He's not a detail. He's a kid who's already had too much instability, and I won't add to it. Colin was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the rag down. Sophie has been through more in her 6 years than most adults get in a lifetime, he said. I'm not doing this if it puts her in the middle of something that's going to leave a mark. He paused. But Ashworth's lawyers already told you about her medical situation. So you know I don't have a lot of options. Neither do I. Then we understand each other. Petra looked at this man. The careful hands, the gray-flecked temples, the way he stood like someone carrying weight he'd long since stopped talking about. I want to meet her, she said, before I sign anything. Something in his expression shifted. The first real thing she'd seen from him. All right, he said. Come on. The apartment was above the workshop, reached by an exterior staircase. It was small and exactly ordered, not because it was sterile, but because someone had made deliberate choices about what mattered. A child's drawings were pinned to the wall beside the kitchen table, a row of small boots by the door, arranged smallest to largest. Bookshelves built into the wall by what were obviously Colin's own hands. A woman was sitting at the kitchen table with a little girl, working on what appeared to be a puzzle involving a very determined giraffe. Nana Bet, this is Ms. Sinclair, Colin said. Petra, this is Betty. She watches Sophie after school. Betty was in her late 60s, with warm eyes and the look of someone who'd seen enough of the world to be unimpressed by most of it. She glanced at Petra with the same quiet assessment Colin used. Then the little girl looked up. Sophie Marsh had her father's gray eyes and a crown of red-brown curls that had clearly won the morning's fight against whatever brush had attempted to tame them. She was wearing a dinosaur shirt and one purple sock, and she studied Petra with the direct intensity of someone who hadn't yet learned to pretend. Hi, Sophie said. Are you the lady Dad has to marry? Betty closed her eyes briefly. Colin made a sound that wasn't quite a cough. Sophie, what? That's what you told me. Sophie looked back at Petra. He said a lady was coming and we were probably going to have to be a family for a while. Are you her? Petra crouched down so she wasn't looking at Sophie from above. I think so. Is that okay with you? Sophie considered this with great seriousness. Do you like puzzles? I like them fine. Are you going to make Dad less sad? The question landed somewhere between Petra's ribs and didn't move. Sophie. Colin's voice was gentle but firm. He tries to hide it, Sophie said, still looking at Petra. But I notice. Petra looked up at Colin, who was looking at his daughter with an expression that could have cracked stone. I can't promise that, Petra told Sophie honestly. But I can promise to try. Sophie nodded, satisfied in the way children were when adults told them the truth. Okay, you can help with the giraffe if you want. His neck keeps not fitting. Petra sat down at the kitchen table in her charcoal blazer, the closer, and helped a 6-year-old with her puzzle while the man she was going to marry stood in the doorway watching, wearing an expression she couldn't read and wasn't sure she was supposed to. Later, when Sophie was absorbed in a book and Betty was washing up, Colin walked Petra to the staircase landing. She's remarkable, Petra said. She is. He leaned against the railing. She's also the reason I'm doing this, so we're clear. I know. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Neither am I. Petra looked out over the narrow street below, at the coffee roaster and the bicycle shop and the ordinary working life of a block in East Toronto. I'll sign the contract. But I need you to understand that Avery is going to get attached, and so might Sophie, and when this ends, I know. It's going to hurt them. I know that too. His voice was flat. But underneath the flatness there was something else, the sound of a man who'd spent years accounting for costs other people didn't notice. I've thought about it from every angle. There's no version of this that doesn't have a cost, so we make it worth the cost. He looked at her, those careful gray eyes. Then we agree, he said. They were married on a Thursday at Toronto City Hall. Petra wore a navy dress she'd bought the previous Saturday. Colin wore a dark gray suit that fit like he'd owned it for a while and taken care of it. No flowers. 2 witnesses. Betty, who cried quietly and tried to pretend she wasn't, and Ashworth's assistant, who checked his phone throughout the ceremony. The officiant was a tired-looking man who'd clearly done this several hundred times and had stopped finding it remarkable around ceremony number 50. When it was over, they shook hands. Then Petra caught herself and didn't know what to do with the hand she'd extended, and Colin took it briefly and let it go. Married. She was married to a carpenter from Leslieville she'd known for 11 days. "The kids are with Betty tonight," Colin said, outside on the plaza. "We should go over house rules." "House rules. I've been thinking about it. We need to be clear with each other before we're living together. Easier to set expectations now than to negotiate them at 10 p.m. when everyone's exhausted and something's gone sideways." Petra looked at him. "You've done this before. Some version of it. Not the marriage, the strategic planning for a difficult situation. I plan ahead." He held the door of the waiting car. "It's the only thing I know how to do well." She got in. He got in beside her. The city moved past the windows. "My rules," she said. "Avery doesn't hear us argue. Whatever we have to work through, we do it privately. He's been through enough, agreed. Sophie doesn't get used as emotional leverage, not by either of us, agreed." Petra paused, "And we're honest with each other, even when it's inconvenient." Colin looked out the window. A long moment passed. "That's harder than it sounds," he said. "I know, do it anyway." He turned to look at her. In the gray afternoon light of a Toronto October, there was something almost wry in his expression, like he was surprised by her, but in a direction he hadn't expected. "All right," he said. "Honest it is." The house was in the West End, in a neighborhood where the trees were old, and the houses had been renovated and renovated again until they'd arrived at something that looked effortless and was anything but. It had 4 bedrooms, a backyard with a maple tree that was currently doing its best impression of a sunset, and a kitchen that made Petra feel like a fraud the moment she walked in. "I don't really cook," she told Colin. "I do." He said it without emphasis, just fact. "Avery has food preferences. He'll eat anything with cheese. He refuses anything with visible onions, but I think he can actually taste them even when they're invisible, so I've given up." Colin almost smiled. "Sophie is the same with mushrooms. We can work with this." They stood in the kitchen of their new house, 2 strangers who were now legally responsible for each other's children, and tried to figure out how to be people in the same space. Avery arrived that evening with Betty and Sophie in tow, and the first 20 minutes were the particular chaos of 2 6-year-olds who were equally shy and equally determined not to show it. They circled each other in the living room like small planets. Sophie broke first. "Do you like dinosaurs?" she asked Avery. "I know a lot about them," he said carefully. "I have a book. I have 3. Sophie looked at him with new respect. "You can see my puzzle. I'm doing a hard one." They disappeared together toward the room that had been designated Sophie's, and Petra stood in the hallway listening to the sound of 2 children deciding to be friends, and felt something unfamiliar move through her. Colin was standing beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She doesn't warm up to people quickly," he said finally. "Usually. A very either." Petra exhaled. Maybe they're the same kind of people, careful ones, like their parents. Another silence, not uncomfortable. "Just present." "I should tell you something," Colin said. Petra turned to look at him. There was something different in his posture. The careful economy of movement had shifted into something more deliberate, more tense. "The reason I needed this arrangement," he said, "it's not just the medical bills." She waited. "Ashworth thinks he hired me because I'm a convenient variable, a low-profile carpenter with no connections to the financial families involved." He looked at her steadily. "He's right about the low-profile part? And the rest? I used to have connections. To all of them." He paused. "My name before I came to Toronto was Colin Hartwell. My father founded Hartwell Capital Group. I left that world 7 years ago when I realized the people I'd grown up trusting were doing things I couldn't be part of." Petra stared at him. "I walked away from everything. The name, the money, the industry. Moved here, learned a trade, built a different life." Something moved through his expression. "Sophie's mother, Renata, she came with me. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. She died when Sophie was 3. The room was very quiet. "The people I walked away from," Colin continued, "they've never entirely stopped watching. They've given me space because I've been invisible. But now someone's been asking questions about where I went, about whether I took anything with me when I left." "Did you?" "Yes," his jaw was tight. "Evidence of things that would end careers and criminal trials. I kept it because I thought one day I'd use it. I haven't yet, but they don't know that." Petra was very still. "Does Ashworth know who you are?" "No, and he won't, if we do this right." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you because you said honest. This is the part that's inconvenient." Petra thought about Avery upstairs, helping Sophie with a dinosaur puzzle. She thought about a little girl who'd lost her mother and a man who'd quietly rebuilt himself from the ground up. She thought about the 214 employees at Fenwick and the Ridley contract and the things she'd been building for a decade. "Is Sophie safe?" she asked. "I've made sure of it, but the arrangement. Being visible again in certain circles carries risk. Then we manage it together. She held his gaze. You should have told me before I signed. I know. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just don't do it again. She straightened. From now on, I need to know the shape of what we're walking into, even when you think you can handle it alone. He looked at her for a long moment, like he was trying to determine whether she meant it. All right, he said. And somehow, standing in the hallway of a house that didn't feel like home yet, listening to two children become friends overhead, Petra believed him. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of strange. Strange in the way ordinary life became strange when you were living it inside a construction. She went to work. He took the kids to school. They ate dinner together most nights. Colin cooked, and it turned out he was quietly excellent at it, the kind of cooking that didn't announce itself, but left you full and warm in a way that lasted. Avery started requesting specific dishes. Sophie and Avery developed an ongoing debate about which dinosaurs would win in various hypothetical conflicts that Petra couldn't follow but found deeply comforting to overhear. At Fenwick, things moved faster. The bridge financing came through. The Ridley contract moved to the final bidding stage. Her COO, a man named Patrick Drummond, who'd worked with her for 6 years, told her she seemed different. Good different or concerning different, she asked. Settled, he said, like he wasn't sure what to do with the word. She wasn't sure either. The first real crisis arrived on a Wednesday morning, 8 weeks into the arrangement. Patrick knocked on her office door with the expression of someone about to ruin her day. St. Joseph's just withdrew from the Ridley Consortium, he said. They're pulling their 3-hospital allocation. Petra looked up. On what basis? They cited concerns about Fenwick's leadership stability. Patrick set a printed email on her desk. The language is careful, but the implication is clear. Someone told them you were a flight risk. Someone. Petra looked at the email. The timing was precise. They were 6 days from the final Ridley vote. Who has access to our bid timeline? Anyone who was in the room at the October board meeting. Patrick hesitated, including Jeffrey Holt, board member. Connected to the 3 families who'd been quietly trying to absorb Fenwick's assets for 2 years. The man who smiled warmly at her in meetings and then voted against every initiative that would make Fenwick too strong to acquire. Set up a call with St. Joseph's procurement chair, Petra said. Today. By 4 p.m., she had a read on the situation. The withdrawal wasn't final. It was conditional, designed to create doubt. If Fenwick could demonstrate stable leadership and secure an alternative anchor partner before Friday's vote, the consortium would hold. She had 2 days to replace a 3-hospital partner. She called Colin from the parking garage because she'd learned that conversations like this one needed to happen somewhere she couldn't be overheard. Someone went after the Ridley contract, she said. I need to find a replacement partner in 48 hours. A pause. What kind of partner? Healthcare system. Minimum 2 hospitals. Has to be credible enough to restore board confidence. She leaned against the concrete pillar. I don't know where to start. I might. His voice was careful. I know people. From before. People who aren't connected to the families involved. If I reach out, it exposes you. Not necessarily. I can do it quietly. Petra was quiet for a moment. Colin, this is what I mean about the shape of things. If you use those connections, what does that look like? What are the real risks? Another pause. Longer. There's a woman named Susan Brandt, he said. She runs Brandt Health in BC. She and my father had a disagreement years ago that ended badly. She's held a grudge against his business partners ever since. She'd take a meeting, and using her, what does that cost you? It tells the people watching me that I'm still operational, still connected. He paused. It moves up whatever they're planning. Petra closed her eyes. Wait it. Then we do it fast, she said. We take the meeting, secure the partnership, close the Ridley vote, and then we deal with whatever comes next. Together. You're sure? I'm sure I'm not letting 214 people lose their jobs because someone decided to play games with my contract. She straightened. Call Susan Brandt. Susan Brandt was in her 60s, sharp as a new blade, and the video call lasted 43 minutes. By the end, she'd agreed to bring Brandt Health's 4 partner hospitals into the Ridley Consortium, pending a brief due diligence period. Hartwell's son, she said near the end, looking at Colin, who was sitting off camera. Your father was a difficult man. Yes, Colin said simply. You're not much like him. I try not to be. She studied him. I'll help because the project has merit and because I've always believed this particular segment of health infrastructure is under-supported. Not for any other reason. That's the only reason I'd accept, Petra said. Susan looked at her. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not quite approval, but the precursor to it. All right, Miss Sinclair, let's get this done. The board vote passed 5-2. Patrick brought her a coffee afterwards and stood in her office doorway, looking at her like she'd done something unusual. "How did you pull the Brandt connection?" he asked. "Private contacts," she said, "from before Fenwick." He nodded slowly, not satisfied but willing to let it go. That night she came home to the sounds of something chaotic in the kitchen. Colin and both children appeared to be making pancakes for dinner, which Avery had apparently campaigned for, and Colin had apparently agreed to after minimal resistance. The kitchen looked like a flour delivery had gone badly wrong. "Mrs. Sinclair," Avery said gravely, using the name he'd apparently borrowed from Sophie. "We're making chocolate chip ones. Dad says we can only have 2 each, but I think that's negotiable." "It isn't," Colin said, not looking up from the stovetop. "Mrs. Sinclair, do you think it is?" Petra looked at Colin's back. At the easy authority in his stance, the way he managed 2 6-year-olds with the same unhurried precision he used in the workshop. "I think," she said carefully, "that 2 sounds right. But 3 is for special occasions. Is today special? You're all covered in flour. That's at least a little special." Avery appeared to accept this logic. Sophie handed Petra an apron with great ceremony. They ate pancakes for dinner, the 4 of them, while the kids argued about whether a triceratops could defeat a stegosaurus in a fair fight and what exactly constituted fair. Colin caught Petra's eye across the table, and something happened in that look. Something small and quiet and nothing like a business arrangement. Later, after bedtime was managed and the kitchen was restored to something approaching order, Petra found Colin on the back porch. The maple in the yard had gone full November now, most of its leaves surrendered to the lawn, and the air had the particular cold clarity of a Toronto night moving toward winter. "Jeffrey Holt," she said. "I think he's the one who went to St. Joseph's." Colin nodded. "I think so too. Is he connected to the people watching you?" A pause. Distantly. "He runs in some of the same circles. Then this isn't over, no." He looked out at the yard. "I made some calls after Susan confirmed. The people I used to know, they've become aware that I'm active again. I was hoping we'd have more time. What does that mean, active? Using old connections. Being visible through people who knew Hartwell Capital." He turned to look at her. "To them, it signals I'm either coming back into the world or preparing to use what I have. Either way, they'll want to resolve it. And by resolve it, you mean they'll apply pressure, first through business channels, then through other ones." The air between them was very still. "We need a plan," Petra said. "I already have one." He said it quietly, without bravado, just fact. "I've been building toward it for 2 years. I just hoped I'd have more time to prepare you for it." She looked at him. In the porch light, his face was open in a way it wasn't during the day, the careful management temporarily suspended. "You're not used to telling people things," she said. "No, someone in your past, that cost you, having people know too much." He was quiet for a moment. "Renata knew everything about me. About what I'd seen, what I'd taken, why I'd left." He looked back at the yard. "She died and took all of it with her. And after that, it seems simpler to just keep things inside the perimeter. That's not sustainable." "I know," he turned back to her. "I'm working on it." "Tell me the plan," she said. "All of it," he told her. It took 40 minutes, standing on the porch in November, and by the end Petra's hands were cold and her mind was very focused. The plan was precise. The evidence he'd kept was comprehensive. 7 years of financial records, communications, and documentation of practices that would dismantle several corporate structures and open at least 3 criminal investigations. He'd already made contact with a regulatory body through a lawyer who didn't know his real name. He'd structured the handover of evidence to be triggered under specific conditions. The conditions were getting closer. "When it happens," he said, "it'll move fast. Arrests, investigations, public exposure. The people who've been watching me will have other things to worry about. And you, I'll have used what I kept. After that, there's nothing left to threaten me with." He paused. "Or the people He stopped. "People you're responsible for," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." The night was very quiet. In the house behind them, 2 children were sleeping. The maple had lost most of its leaves and still looked solid-rooted, like something that had survived enough seasons to stop worrying about them. "I'm not going anywhere," Petra said. Not because she'd planned to say it, because it was true. Colin looked at her for a long moment. Those careful gray eyes opened up around the edges. "You've been saying things like that for weeks," he said. "I keep meaning them." He was quiet. Then so quietly she almost missed it, "So have I." The crisis came on a Thursday night 3 weeks later. The security alarm was new. Colin had installed it without explanation 2 days before, and when it went off, Petra was already awake, already in the hallway, already moving toward Avery's room when she heard the sound from downstairs that wasn't the alarm. Colin met her on the landing. He had Sophie, who was more asleep than awake, against his shoulder. "Avery," Petra said. "Get him. Backstairs. Betty's outside with the car." She didn't ask. She got Avery, who woke up confused and frightened and held onto her with both arms, and they went down the back stairs and through the kitchen and out into the cold night. Betty was there, engine running. She took Sophie without a word, the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been given instructions and memorized them. Colin stayed behind. He was back in 12 minutes. When he came out, he was unruffled. The two men who'd come into the house were zip-tied to kitchen chairs, and the security footage was already uploading to 3 locations simultaneously. The police arrived, then federal authorities, because it turned out the men were connected to something larger, something Colin had already reported quietly 3 days ago when he'd known this was coming. They sat in Betty's living room at 2 in the morning, both children finally asleep on the couch under a blanket Betty had produced from somewhere, and Petra looked at Colin and said, "You knew. I knew it was soon. I didn't know the exact night, and the federal connection. The evidence I submitted last week. It fast-tracked something they'd been building for longer than I have." Petra looked at the sleeping children. Avery had his arm around Sophie in sleep, unconsciously protective. Sophie had her head against his shoulder. "Is it over?" "The immediate part," he exhaled. "The larger investigation will take months. The public exposure will happen in stages. But the people who are watching me, they'll be managing their own situations. And us? What do we tell people about us?" He looked at the children, then at her. "What do you want to tell them?" She thought about everything she'd wanted when she'd walked into Ashworth's boardroom. The financing, the contract, the title. The things she'd thought were the measure of success. She thought about pancake dinners and flour on the counter. About a little girl who'd noticed her father's sadness. About a boy who'd stopped asking when things would get better and quietly started making them better himself, one afternoon at a time, in a house that had started to feel like something permanent. "The contract expires in 9 months, she said. "I know. I don't want it to." Colin was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged the look in his eyes, the things that had moved beneath them in the last 3 months. "I'm not easy," he said finally. "I plan ahead because I don't know how not to. I keep things close. I have a complicated past that's currently being processed by federal regulators. I know all of that. And Renata, I loved her. That's not gone. I'm not asking you to make it gone." He looked at her. "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking if you want to choose this." She held his gaze. "Not the contract, not the arrangement. This, what we've actually built, the kids, the dinners, the back porch conversations. I want to know if you want to keep building it." Sophie shifted in her sleep. Avery's arm tightened slightly around her without him waking. "Yes," Colin said. "Simple, clean, no performance in it. Then we do." They sat in Betty's living room until dawn came, talking through what came next. The practical things first. Colin's real identity would eventually surface in the investigation coverage. Fenwick would need a prepared statement. Ashworth would need a conversation she was not looking forward to. And then the less practical things, the kind you couldn't put in a statement. "Avery asked me something last week," Petra said. "He wanted to know if Colin was going to be his dad." Colin was quiet. "I told him I didn't know yet." She looked at him. "I want to give him a better answer. What did he say when you told him you didn't know?" He said okay. Then he asked if Sophie's dad could teach him to build something out of wood. Colin's expression shifted, something cracking open in it that she'd only seen a handful of times. That moment when the management dropped, and he was just a man who loved his kid and had been alone for a very long time. "He already asked me," he said. 3 weeks ago, we've been making a birdhouse." Petra looked at him. "I should have told you," he said. "No, I'm glad you didn't." She smiled. "Some things should just happen." 6 months later, the Ridley contract was signed. Fenwick's revenue was up 31%. Jeffrey Holt resigned from the board quietly, which was the most dignified outcome he was going to get given that federal investigators had questions for him. Colin's name, his real name, appeared in 2 national business publications and 1 court filing. He answered the questions that needed answering and declined to answer the rest. The companies his family had built were in the middle of structural audits that would take years to resolve. He seemed lighter for it, actually, like he'd been waiting a long time to put something down. The children started 2nd grade. Sophie's teacher told Colin she had a gift for visual problem solving. Avery's teacher told Petra he was the most emotionally perceptive 6-year-old she'd worked with in 15 years. "He gets it from you," Colin said when she told him. "He gets it from his own self," she said. "He just had a good example around." It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a Thursday evening in the kitchen, and he was making soup, and she was reviewing a contract amendment, and both kids were in the other room building something complicated out of the wooden blocks Colin had made them. But Colin turned from the stove and looked at her with those quiet gray eyes and said, I want to get married again, properly, with them. And Petra looked up from her contract and said, City Hall or backyard? Backyard, under the maple. That tree is half dead. It'll be fine by spring. It was, as it turned out. By spring it was better than fine. It put out more leaves than the year before, the way old things sometimes did when the conditions finally turned in their favor. They got married on a Saturday in June, under the maple in the West End backyard, with Betty crying openly, and Patrick from Fenwick standing awkwardly in a suit that didn't quite fit, and Susan Brandt sending flowers from BC with a note that said only, "Good work." Sophie wore purple because it was her favorite. Avery wore a bow tie because Colin had offered to teach him how to tie it, and he'd been practicing for a week. When the officiant asked if they took each other, they did, like they meant it, because they did. That evening, after the kids were asleep and the backyard was still strung with lights, Petra and Colin sat on the porch with the remains of a bottle of something good and let the night be quiet around them. "I walked into this trying to save a company," she said. "I walked into this trying to save Sophie's medical bills and stay invisible. We didn't do very well at invisible. No." He looked at the yard, at the maple, standing steady in the June dark, "but we did all right at the rest." Petra leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. In the house, in their rooms, both kids slept the deep and confident sleep of children who knew where they were going to be in the morning. Not because nothing bad would ever happen. Bad things always had the possibility of happening, but because the people who were supposed to be there had proven that they were going to be there. That was the thing about being careful, Petra had learned. It wasn't about controlling what happened. It was about being present enough and honest enough and willing enough to stay that when things happened, you weren't facing them alone. She'd walked into Ashworth's boardroom looking for rescue. She'd found something harder and better than that. A partner, a family, a life she'd chosen with both eyes open. And every ordinary morning since, that was the choice she kept making. Not because it was easy, because it was worth it. And that, it turned out, was the only measure of success that had ever really mattered.